current PIN method, which has the encryption, and sign in, sign out for flex and the main attendance, which could also use a student ID with all the data preloaded, which would speed that up by something like 80%.
So that's just the baseline of what we want to do from the student ID standpoint. So as far as what we can do with it, that can be a lot more than like looking into the future. That can be a lot more than just implementing it and signing in, signing out much. We've thrown around some conversations about maybe having like a student-run coffee bar where we can store funds linked with those cards, and you could buy tickets with them. You could get stuff from the bookstore, and just kind of another tool we can give students to be able to make the school a little bit more interactive.
So from your perspective, Joe, we're wondering about data collection and storage in terms of a database perhaps. Last year we were able to use the Destiny database and the library pulled data for us and allowed Jared, his brother, to kind of do some things with some scanners for the flex in and out process, and it was working. There was going to have to be a batch upload back into Skyward by the librarian and the people who had access to Skyward. So I don't know if that's something that you think might work, or so it's the data capture and you know, that kind of thing that you could help us with.
So there was something similar presented last year, a system that was put together, and I know the tripping point on that was the manual intervention that it required on a daily basis. And so there was reluctance by anybody in administration, that building administration as well as our central office administration, to add that responsibility onto anybody's plate who had to go and touch that every day to do an upload. So they didn't see it as a good viable source because it didn't take away that the person having to spend the time working on it. They would rather have seen something automated.
So with our redesigned system for sign in, sign out, it actually goes directly into the current Google Forms and enters it in as if you just typed it into the laptop or iPad, really.
And then does the Google form talk to Skyward now? Is that how that works?
That I do not know. So I think ultimately, you mentioned a number of things that will involve a lot of different departments, various specialists within the district. So we have our data analysts, who are those folks at central office who manage Skyward. They're the ones who create all those accounts in Skyward, and when we have special accounts for the accounts we have now for sign in and sign out, they're used in the clinic, they're used in the front office. Well, front office is using a different system. In the clinic and now in the guidance office, they're using a Skyward sign-in process where student signs in and then the guidance counselors can go in and make some edits to some things and sign it back out. So it's a way of tracking who visited and why and that kind of stuff. So I imagine something similar to that can probably be implemented. So it would involve the data analysts for the Skyward side of it. Certainly, building administration, so Mr. Urban is the ultimate, say here, whether he's okay with the project going forward.
Yes.
We have done a great work for
I-
Mr. Urban to proceed.
And that's good. So that's good that you've taken that step. So I think one of the next steps is going to be to take a written description of what you're describing to me, of what you want to implement. If you have specific devices or particular types of chips that you're talking about, these NFS chips, you may have to, I don't know, if there's some links to an article that talks about that. Some of our folks at central office may be familiar with them, but certainly our network administrator would get involved in this, because anything we do that's going to link back to our systems, he would need to be involved. So our network admin is Chris Corbett, and so he would be the primary person to probably start talking to about the network side of things.
You guys should write this stuff down.
So you may want to reach out to him. Our directors are Jeff Harrison and Tom Coons. That's Kouns. So Mr. Harrison and Mr. Coons would be involved in anything that happens here. Mr. Harrison normally gets involved mostly on the curriculum side. Mr. Coons gets involved on sort of the nuts and bolts of the network side. They work together, but kind of that's where their primary focuses are. And then Mr. Corbett, he's as our network, admin guy. He's the one who's usually getting his hands dirty into the equipment and making it so that if you have devices that need to be static IP'd and on the network, he needs to approve that, and they need to figure out which IP addresses are going to be used, and all of the nuts and bolts of that, he would be involved there. So he certainly needs to be part of this discussion. Again, the data analysts from the Skyward side to find out what capabilities are in Skyward, what can they do. There's a lot of functionality in Skyward. I think a lot of it is already there and available to us. So we need them to figure out how they can design something that would be implemented, to interface with what you're doing. Costs, how do you plan on funding the project?
With the grant that I have.
Okay, and the reason I say that is because it is not a small undertaking to replace everybody's student ID, which is just a plain old plastic card with no real technology in it, to one with a chip inside.
So, when we looked into the cost for every one of these cards, it would come out to, depending on the exact chip, somewhere between 5 to 15 cents on top of the normal student ID. And we imagined, and we also proposed this to Mr. Urban, that if we put that onto the yearly dues, that 5 to 15 cent per student cost wouldn't add up to anything disagreeable.
And that's fine. Currently, badges our primary badges are printed by our photo company. You have your photo taken for the yearbook, and then the badge shows up with your photos, and you want it with that. Sometimes we print badges in the media center as well when we need to do that during the school year, but they're all done with a printer that we have. So just make sure that the badges that you're choosing are able to work with the printers that we're using to actually print, the pictures and the logo and everything on them. So,
Which I proposed using that badge and just using barcode technology, because we can peel and stick that to the back
Mhm.
like we did last year.
Right.
So instead of going the chip route, which I love that idea, if we could utilize the badge they already have with barcode technology on the back, we wouldn't skip that step.
right. And so then the question there would be, who's gonna maintain that? Because if you have a barcode that can be stuck on, you have a barcode that can
That's
be
true.
peeled off and wear off. So who's gonna be in charge of maintaining that? When a barcode stops working, who's gonna print a new one? You'll have to factor that in, somebody that's gonna take some manual intervention there. I mean, it would be with chips as well, because they have to be programmed. And occasionally, something that's electronic is gonna go awry and it's not gonna read properly, and someone needs to fix that. So just make sure you factor that into, who would need to be responsible for that, or if you don't know, that needs to be a topic of discussion. When I would think that the next meeting would include these multiple people. You'd have to get a meeting together to get everyone in the room so that they can start interacting and say, well, I can implement this, yes or no, yes, that'll work on our network, or no, it won't, and so they can start interacting with each other to find out how viable, your solution is. So I'm thinking the data analysts, there's 3 data analysts, but if you start with Mr. Harrison and Mr. Coons, I would start there, since they are our directors, and let them know that Mr. Urban has already been, and keep him in the know, keep him in the loop always, because he would probably want to be part of that discussion as well. I would start there and have them pull in the people they feel they need to, and I think you want to arrange a meeting to say, this is something that we want to present, this is what from what you've said to me, it sounds like something that can be implemented, but I'm gonna need some verification from some of these other folks that they can do it. And once it's in place, then also how we're gonna support it, who's gonna be responsible for supporting that system when it goes down, that kind of a thing. But that's all the logistics that'll be discussed before implementing something.
Which is where we failed last year, because we worked in isolation, and the solution worked, but it worked in this room. So
Mhm.
we took it out and it worked as long as we managed it, but as soon as the class ended, we worked in isolation, didn't include you guys, and so it
Right.
sits today not
Yeah.
used, so.
We're talking about student data, so and again, there's also legal issues where it comes to data you can collect and stuff like that. So since we're a school, we're a government institution, and so we have to follow federal guidelines, federal educational guide. We gotta follow the Department of Education guidelines for not only the state of Indiana, but federal guidelines as well. So I'm not an expert in that by any means, but that's where when you start involving our directors, Mr. Harrison, Mr. Coons, they can start having those discussions. There are some other people at central office who will probably be involved in that process, because anything we do with data collection has to be run through. That gets run past the lawyers and things get signed off on, and ultimately the board may have a say in all of this as well, what we implement, so the school board. So the culmination of this might be a presentation to the school board eventually. I don't know how much they get involved in the deciding if the solution is okay to implement, but certainly if there's funds that are gonna be pulled, you say in a grant, if it's a grant, then that kinda makes it easier, but if there's any support that we need from our end, has a dollar figure attached to that. If the technology specialist, myself, and Mr. Aker need to interact with this system in any way, they're gonna factor in that this is now part of our job, so there's a dollar
Right.
figure that's attached to that. So again, that just has to all be considered. I don't necessarily see any of this as a major stumbling block, as long as the solution works and it works okay on our network, and if all the pieces fall in place. I don't think it's anything you can't, overcome and get past if you take all the necessary steps and involve all the necessary people. So I would start with those folks, Mr. Harrison, Mr. Coons, keep Mr. Urban in the know on what's going on, because he, again, may want to be in that meeting, where you present it. But the first thing I would do is this presentation that you've kind of given me, I would try to fine tune that, and I would get that in writing. Because they're going to look for a written scope of, what's it gonna take to do this, all the pieces and parts. So get as much as you can, clear and concise, in writing, and you'll wanna submit that to Mr. Harrison and Mr. Coons and let them know that this is an idea that you'd like to implement, you wanna have further discussion on this. And again, they can start pulling in the multiple people. And I'm gonna take my notes and I'm gonna reach out to them and let them know that I've sat through this presentation of yours, and that they should look forward to hearing from you with more details.
Great. Do you guys have any more questions while he's in here? Technical questions?
Well, to an extent, I had hopes that all of our projects would kind of interface with the existing systems at a fairly high level, almost to the point of, like, for the lunch lines, automating input, where it would just literally replace the students typing in the information with it automatically typing in through the computer API.
When you scan the badge.
Yeah. So with that in mind, and with everything integrating into like the current systems at like a very high level, almost just automating input, how would that factor into how feasible this is, or how much we'd have to work out this whole
It's a
project?
good question, and that certainly would be a factor. So it gets back to the whole privacy thing.
Mhm.
And when you're scanning that and the information is coming up on the computer, like say from the cafeteria perspective, there's only so much information that the cafeteria can see. They really only see their lunch accounts side of it. By scanning the badge, the cafeteria member cannot see all the
Right.
details of
And-
someone, like your addresses and phone numbers and contact information and all of that other,
And
all those other things.
detail
So
that would be given to them is the literal student ID being inputted in, and whatever information is associated with that once it's put through the lunch program.
right. So you mentioned a student-run snack bar or coffee bar
Yeah,
or
that was an
something of
idea
that nature.
from,
So certainly the only, if you're scanning there at a snack bar, the only thing it needs to know is that I scan it and there's funds in the account. So that piece of it, that interface would be one interface that would only probably access that, just the account, student name and ID number, and how much money is the balance in their account, and the ability to deduct from that you know, similar to what the cafeteria does now. Of course, the cafeteria is using a piece of software called PAC, and, you know, so there's an expense there on that software. So, you know, what type of software interface is gonna run, you know, what you have, that's certainly going to be a factor. Again, if it's something that's a one-time purchase and it's coming from a grant, that's fine, but what about, you know, future updates as they update
Sustainability is
it?
not mine. I'll do implementation costs, but then
Right.
going forward, sustainability.
Exactly,
will be
and so, you know, is this something that you'd be, you know, once you buy a license one time, is that it? Or is it a yearly license, and so is that something you need to figure out how to fund? So again, that's gonna be part of it, and that may be something that is partially funded if it's not, excuse me, if it's not overly expensive, maybe that's something that's funded by the building. The building has funds that they can use at their discretion for various projects and stuff like that, so maybe that's something that Mr. Urban is interested in funding,
Or if
maintenance
they
of that,
make
you know,
enough
going
revenue
forward.
off the coffee bar, it can purchase that.
Exactly, you know, so yes, does part of those profits come off the top to automatically maintain that? So again, it's really, what is your focus? Is your ultimate focus to, you know, make a big profit? Or is it mostly to offer a service? And, you know, is something breaking even enough to make it worthwhile? Those are the things you need to think about. Because you may not want to, you may want to say this is a lot of work to implement. Obviously, somebody needs to run the coffee bar, so if it's student run, somebody's got to maintain schedules. How do you get people to do it? Are they doing it for free, or are you paying them? You know, so all of these things you need to factor in, because somebody's got to foot those costs, and those are going to be ongoing. So, again, that's one interface. We were talking about data we got on that subject. So, yeah, coffee bar wise, it's very limited, you know, what it needs for data in the interface. But if you're implementing something else completely, what you talked about, a student sign in and sign out system, again, it may only need their name and ID, and it's uploading into a system. It all depends on who's gonna have access to that data once it gets in there. You know, if it's just as simple as sign in and sign out, and you're not gonna, say, other students are not gonna interact with the data,
Mhm.
then it may be easier to implement. If other students are gonna do that, there's some privacy issues we need to be concerned about.
I'm gonna caution you guys to pick one thing. So what is the purpose of this project? And it's either coffee bar, lunch, or sign in, sign out. It's not gonna be all three.
Yeah,
That's way out of scope, that is way too convoluted. So your team's gotta decide, what are you gonna tackle? It's scalable. It's not that you can't expand on that after we get it implemented, but you've gotta pick one of these three, and then that's what you're gonna focus
I
on.
think simplicity, as simple as you can make it for an initial project, because once you put the equipment in place, once you get the hardware in place, you have the technology there, and it's usable, yeah, you can start to expand it. You could start to say, hey, we're using it for this coffee bar, and we've done this successfully for a year or two. You know, other people may look at that and go, okay, what else can we use this badge for? Colleges are doing things just like this, okay? And I'm
Absolutely.
sure you've seen this, and you either know people who are in college, or you've seen it yourself on visits, but yeah, they have cards that you scan absolutely everywhere. You know, you walk into an office and scan it in, and it signs you in, and the person there has all your pertinent information that they need. But you can also walk over to the cafeteria and scan it, and they know how much money's in your account. That badge is your lifeline at college. It's what gets you into, it's what scans you into your dorm room, and so there's different things happening. It's accessing different types of data. You know, yes, you belong in that dorm. Yes, you have money in your account. They're different things, but it's all the same system. So, but there is a cost. There's generally a big piece of software on the back end and some hardware running that.
Well, so things like we have, depending on the exact chip, it's going to be either 144, 540, or 888 bytes to store information, which is more than enough to store in student ID, first name, last name, and a couple other quick identifiers like that. So I don't think that we really need a massive database to be pulling everything from, because a lot of the information can be stored locally on the chip. So I think from a hardware perspective there, we wouldn't need to put up that much more
Right.
expense.
Right. I think the big thing is gonna be the verification system, because when you scan it, where is it verifying? It's probably,
Right.
probably gonna verify back to Skyward, because Skyward is our ultimate database of
Right.
students and all of their information. And there's a lot of granular control in Skyward, because I can tell you, I can log into Skyward and I can see certain things, but there's other things I can't see, because I haven't been given those rights. So there is the ability to tweak Skyward and do all kinds of amazing things with it. Again, that's where, when you start this next level of conversation, you have that meeting, and it starts, once they decide that it's a potential viable thing that they're gonna move forward with, and they pull the data analysts in and say, okay, what can we do and how do we make Skyward work? That's where, like I said, the data analysts, our network administrator, and our directors, they're gonna start putting their heads together and say, what all do we need to do? And, because somebody ultimately is gonna be responsible for managing, like I said, the support, the dollar figure. Even if it's coming through as a grant, they have to look at going forward. Somebody has to document that. And generally speaking, any of this stuff goes by the board, goes by the school board before it gets implemented. They have their say in quite a bit. So, but again, you're on the right track. Going to Mr. Urban first was smart. I think at this point, you want to go to our directors. Mr. Harrison, Mr. Coons, they're probably going to be your next points of contact to reach out. But before you do that, you want a written scope of what you're planning to do. Basically, you're proposing this to them, and the buck can stop right there if it's not organized well. So make sure, it sounds like you've put a lot of thought into it. You've been working on this project. So you want to get that in writing as best you can to make it clear and keep it simple. And then hopefully they can keep it moving in the right direction for you.